The millionaire's son lay still on the marble floor, eyes shut, skin gone pale, body cold with shock, while the maid knelt beside him, her hand shaking, holding something small, dark, and moving. "Camille, what did you do?" the butler gasped, frozen with fear, voice ricocheting under the chandelier. Footsteps pounded the staircase like a drum roll before a verdict, and then Alexander Harrington, man of mergers and spotless headlines, appeared in the doorway, stripped of composure. "What happened to my son?" he demanded, not as a titan, but as a father dangling over terror. Camille tried to answer, but the thing in her palm gave a slick twitch under the light and the words fled her throat. For one breathless beat, the world held its lungs. Then came a sound that split the silence like a blade through silk. "Father!" It was barely more than a breath, a tremor with edges, but the name landed in the room like thunder. The butler staggered back. Alexander's hand rose as if to steady the air itself. And Camille, young, steady, faithful Camille, closed her fingers around the writhing speck and stared at the boy on the marble, tears starting with the dawning shape of a miracle. Before we go any further, take a breath, because what you're about to witness isn't just another story about wealth and tragedy. It's about faith, courage, and the kind of miracle money could never buy. If stories like this, where ordinary people defy the impossible and change lives, move you as deeply as they move us, then don't just watch and scroll. Join this community. Hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and be part of a growing circle of viewers who believe that compassion still wins, even in the coldest places. Now, let's go back to the moment when everything inside the Harrington mansion changed forever. Hours before that word changed everything, the Harrington mansion breathed the way palaces do when they have no one to impress. The morning staff drifted like tidewater through long corridors, fixing what already gleamed, dustless frames, crystal that threw small suns on the floor. Even silence had a schedule here. The grandfather clock struck in velvet. Doors clicked instead of slammed. Voices lived in polite parentheses, never at the center of a sentence. This was the house Alexander built for order when life refused to obey him, a fortress against the one problem no dividend could conquer. Henry Harrington was 10 years old and had never heard rain. He pressed his ear to glass when storms came, searching for sound through temperature, tracing the shiver of the pain with fingertips as if music could be learned by touch. He counted cars in the driveway by their shadows moving across the foyer, arranging his toy versions in straight military rows. Midnight blue, pearl white, onyx black. 3, 3, 3, because neatness felt like control. He knew his father's shape by the way the light changed when Alexander stepped into a room, a tall interruption that carried the scent of a barbershop and cold winter offices. When people spoke around him, Henry watched their mouths and guessed at weather from lips alone, rounded for storm, tight for meeting, flat for later. The boy was brilliant at reading what the world refused to say aloud. Alexander loved his son with the helplessness of a man who can fix everything except the thing he cares about. He believed in solutions you could wire money to. He believed in names that opened doors, Zurich, Boston, Tokyo, in acronyms that sounded like miracles, MRI, AI, ENT, in doctors whose framed degrees turned corridors into galleries of hope. He paid for possibilities by the dozen, flew at midnight, signed checks without blinking, shook the hands of men who promised sound like it was a product with an estimated delivery date. And when the planes brought him back to the same quiet boy in the same quiet room, Alexander filed the failure where he filed all danger, under control. If the world would not make noise for his son, the house would make silence for him perfectly. Camille Johnson entered that perfection as if stepping onto ice that might crack. Mid-20s, new uniform with stitches that still remembered the needle, braids tucked back, eyes that had learned to carry both kindness and history. She moved like a whisper but looked like a vow. She called the butler sir, learned the routes of silver carts, the moods of soap on marble, the geography of a home that was more museum than heart. On her first day, a footman told her, the Harrington child prefers space. On her second, the housekeeper added, Mr. Harrington prefers distance. On her third, Camille saw the boy's hands, quick, exact, careful, lining up small cars on the landing, and everything she had been told about space and distance collided with a memory she had never escaped. Caleb had been 7. He had woken with pain sewn through his ear like wire under skin. Clinics were full of waiting, and waiting was full of cost, and cost was taller than her mother's courage could climb. The infection moved like weather through Caleb's head, and then the world closed for him. First the birds, then the radio, then their mother's lullaby. He learned to smile with his eyes. He learned to sit very still when the hurting came. When Camille was 16, he died on a Wednesday with the fan whining in the window, and afterward she decided that if she ever met pain again wearing a child's face, she would not look away. So when she saw Henry on the staircase with his neat small rose, she set a paper crane at the end of his highway and kept walking. No announcement. No lesson. A gift a boy could accept without owing anyone his trust. Later, when she returned, the crane had migrated to the middle of the line, a white bird among the cars like snow that forgot where to land. The next afternoon, she left a marble the color of ocean held in a thumbprint. It disappeared. On the third day, she set a card down with a stick figure sun and the word hello in careful block letters. When she came back, the card was there, and beneath hello, in a smaller hand, a drawn ear and a question mark. Her throat tightened. She answered in pictures, a mouth singing, a heart, a window with rain. Every exchange felt like building a bridge with thread. By the second week, Camille had learned the mansion's weather. The library was warm in the morning where the sun fell through Roman shades in perfect pleats. The gallery was always a degree colder than comfort. The kitchen collected the staff's quiet laughter like spoons in a cup. She also learned Henry's routes. The east hall to the tall window when clouds threatened, the sitting room with the eighth step that creaked, the conservatory where leaves made a language on the floor. Sometimes he would shadow her reflection in the glass as she polished, practicing how to wave without using sound, practicing how to grin without apology. She never touched him. She never tried to own his trust. She simply stayed long enough for the boy to measure that she would not vanish. Alexander noticed the temperature shift around his son the way a sailor notices a current, not by sight but by how the ship rides. The staff were too comfortable. The boy looked less like a vase on a shelf and more like a child who might become someone. Alexander found this intolerable and threatening, the way tenderness always threatens a fortress. "Keep to your duties," he told Camille, not unkindly but with the finality of a period. "My son is not your project." She bowed her head. "Yes, sir." Inside, the old Wednesday ache uncoiled. The first time Camille saw him press his right ear with a wince that sharpened his whole face, it was raining. The storm had curled around the house like a cat, rubbing its wet against the windows. Henry stood at the tall pane in the east hall, cheek to glass, fingers mapping the cold. He flinched suddenly and stepped back, palm clamped to his ear, eyes gone from curious to afraid. Camille reached the edge of his invisible circle and stopped. She didn't cross it. She knelt, palms open where he could see them, and shaped the sign for pain, with a question in her eyebrows. He blinked, nodded, and touched the delicate tunnel where sound should have lived. She lifted her hands again. "Doctor." He shook his head hard, lips shaping a soft no that broke without noise. No doctors. Fear burned in the air like electricity. That night, the mansion exhaled its practiced quiet. Camille lay on the narrow bed in the staff wing and stared at the ceiling, as if answers were hidden in plaster. The fan hummed. The clock ticked. Memory unfurled with terrible patience. Caleb with a hot cloth to his ear, her mother counting bills like rosary beads, the clinic door with a sign that said closed for lunch and felt like a betrayal large enough to break the sky. She sat up. The room smelled faintly of soap and starch. She opened the small Bible on her trunk but didn't read, fingers pressed between pages the way a child holds a friend's hand in the dark. "Lord," she whispered to a God she addressed like a neighbor in the hallway, "if there is anything I can do that is not foolish or proud, show me. And keep that boy from hurting." She closed the book and listened to the house sleep. Morning returned with its clean knives of light. Camille took the service stairs and found her way to the landing where Henry's toy cars normally paraded. Today they were in a circle, as if waiting for a story to happen in the middle. She watched the door at the end of the hall breathe open, the draft at work, and then looked down at the paper in her apron pocket. She had folded it last night with care that felt like prayer, a crane from copy paper borrowed from the laundry ledger, wings sharp and hopeful, belly fat with hidden wish. She set it at the heart of the circle and stepped back. It looked small in all that space, a white decision in a world of polished black. From the shadow of the corridor, Henry appeared, pajama shirt wrinkled at one shoulder. He paused when he saw the offering, eyes narrowing the way minds do when they're rearranging maps. He glanced up and found her watching. She didn't wave. She didn't nod. She simply stood like a lighthouse and let him sail. He stepped forward, crouched, and with the gentlest of careful thumbs, lifted the crane into his palm. For a moment he held it near his ear, as if paper wings might whisper. Then he tucked it into the pocket over his small heart and looked at her with something new sitting behind his gaze. Gratitude, or the beginning of it. Camille exhaled a breath she had not realized she was saving. The house felt a fraction warmer, the silence less cruel. Somewhere far off, a door clicked. The schedule moved on. She picked up her cart, and he walked beside her for 3 steps before veering into his own orbit again. It was nothing. It was everything. In a mansion built to perfect what money could polish, 2 people had just agreed on a wordless truth. Someone was listening. By afternoon, Alexander stood on a balcony with his phone to his ear, trading a language of numbers and leverage while the groundsmen trimmed hedges into obedient shapes. He did not see his son at the window press, or the way Camille's reflection hovered there like a promise. But when evening folded the light and the staff dimmed the chandeliers, the paper crane slept in Henry's pocket, and in the morning it was gone from the circle, replaced by nothing visible, unless you knew how to look for changes in air. That was how the bond began, not with thunder, but with a small bird that knew how to carry weight far beyond paper. And somewhere in the immaculate quiet of the Harrington estate, where even silence kept its appointments, a different kind of sound prepared itself, the kind that arrives first in the heart and only later in the ear. The bond between the millionaire's son and the maid didn't bloom with grand gestures. It grew in quiet corners and brief, wordless exchanges that most people in the mansion never noticed. Mornings began with sunlight spilling across the marble staircase, where Henry Harrington would already be sitting, his toy cars lined up like a convoy waiting for orders. Camille Johnson, the new maid with calm eyes and a careful heart, passed by every day with her cleaning cart. And every day, she left behind something small, a paper crane, a note, a marble. At first, Henry ignored them. But one morning, Camille saw the marble sitting at the center of his car formation, polished from the warmth of his hand. The next day, he was waiting for her. She smiled, and he pointed to the paper crane tucked in his pocket. He couldn't speak, but he didn't need to. The look said everything. What began as silent kindness turned into a rhythm of understanding. They developed a language of their own, half drawn, half signed. In the conservatory, Camille taught him simple signs. Sun, bird, thank you. Henry's laughter, soundless but alive, filled the air between them. He would sign funny and pretend to trip, making her cover her mouth to stop from laughing aloud. But the mansion was not blind. Servants whispered in the corridors, their words soft but sharp. "She's getting too close," one maid murmured while polishing silver. "Mr. Harrington won't like that." The butler overheard the laughter echoing faintly from the conservatory and frowned. The next morning, he found Camille in the hall. "Miss Johnson," he said, voice low but heavy with warning. "Mr. Harrington values order above all. He doesn't approve of sentimentality among the staff." Camille folded her hands politely. "He's just a boy, sir. He gets lonely." "Loneliness isn't yours to fix," the butler replied. "Keep your distance." She nodded, but her heart disobeyed. Some distances weren't meant to be kept. Later that week, while dusting the window ledge near the stairs, she saw Henry wince suddenly, pressing his right ear hard with his palm. His face tightened, brows pinched in pain. She froze. "Henry," she mouthed, knowing he could read her lips. "Pain." He nodded once, quick and frightened. Camille gestured, asking silently, "Doctor? Help." His head shook violently. His small hands flew into the air, forming signs sharp with fear. "No hospital. No doctors. They hurt me." Her stomach dropped. That look in his eyes. She had seen it before. Years ago, when her little brother Caleb had clutched his ear the same way, terrified of the men in white coats who promised help but brought only more pain. Caleb had been 7 when the infection took his hearing. They didn't have money for proper care. She remembered the long nights her mother spent praying, the hospital doors that stayed closed, and the screams when someone finally tried to fix him. By the time they realized the damage was permanent, the boy who once sang church songs with her could no longer hear her voice. She had sworn, standing over his grave, that she would never turn away from another child in pain. And now, standing in the marble hall of the Harrington mansion, that promise came rushing back. Over the next few days, Camille watched Henry more closely. His cheerful gestures grew slower, his smiles shorter. She noticed him touching his ear often, grimacing when loud lights flickered. Sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, he pressed his head against the cool glass of the window, as if the cold could quiet something inside. One morning, sunlight streamed through the garden window, painting gold on his skin. Henry sat quietly, rubbing the side of his face. Camille knelt beside him. "May I look?" she mouthed. He hesitated, then nodded faintly. She leaned closer, tilting his head gently toward the light. What she saw froze her heart. Deep inside his ear, so deep it shimmered in shadow, something glistened. It wasn't wax. It wasn't dirt. It was dark, wet, and strangely alive. For a moment, she thought it moved. She blinked, then leaned back quickly, trying to hide her alarm. Henry looked at her, eyes full of questions. Camille hesitated, then signed carefully, "Something there. We tell your father." Immediately, panic overtook him. His hands trembled. "No doctors," he signed frantically, repeating it again and again. "No doctors. They hurt me." She reached out but stopped herself. "It's okay," she whispered, though he couldn't hear her voice. "I won't let them hurt you." That night, Camille lay awake in her small room behind the laundry hall. The ticking clock sounded too loud, like a heartbeat reminding her of Caleb's last night. She saw her mother's tears, her brother's still body, and the quiet that came after. She pressed her palms together and whispered softly into the darkness, "Lord, show me what to do. I can't lose another child to silence." The wind brushed the window pane. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked. Camille sat up. The mansion was supposed to be asleep, yet the air felt strange, alive. She listened. At first, there was nothing but the low hum of the night. Then came a faint sound. Scratching. Soft, deliberate, and close. She held her breath. The noise came again, slow, irregular, like something dragging lightly along wood. It wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from down the corridor, from the direction of Henry's room. Camille rose quietly, bare feet against the cold floor. Her hand found the doorknob, but she didn't turn it. The scratching stopped. Silence fell, thick and heavy. For a long moment, she stood there, heart hammering, eyes on the dim stretch of hallway. The lights flickered once, then steadied. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was imagination. But as she turned back toward her bed, she heard it one last time, so faint it could have been a whisper. A scrape. A soft tap. Then silence. Camille froze in the doorway. Her hand pressed against her chest. She whispered to herself, "Lord, what is happening to that boy?" The night gave no answer. Only the soundless hum of a house that hid too many secrets. And in the east wing, behind a closed door, the millionaire's son turned restlessly in his sleep, one hand clutching his ear, while somewhere in the dark, something very small moved. Night in the Harrington mansion wasn't truly dark. It was curated. Lamps in the hallways dimmed to a polite glow, chandeliers breathed out to embers, and the carpets drank the sound of footsteps like secrets. Camille Johnson lay awake on her narrow bed, eyes open to the ceiling, counting the silent seconds between the tick of the hallway clock and the soft sighs of an old house settling. She had prayed already, "Lord, show me what to do," but the prayer wouldn't end. It returned like a tide and would not recede. Then she heard it again, that almost imagined scratching, faint and uneven, as if a moth dragged a thread along wood. She sat up. The sound came from the east wing, the direction of Henry Harrington's room. Barefoot, she eased her door open. The corridor glowed in puddles of amber light. Paintings watched in their frames. The house smelled like linen and lemon, and the memory of dinner that no one had truly tasted. Camille walked, quiet as a vow, palms hovering near the walls the way hands hover near someone about to fall. By Henry's door, the scratching thinned into silence. She knocked softly, then turned the handle and slipped inside. He was awake, sitting on the edge of his bed, knees pulled up, one hand clamped over his right ear. Moonlight striped his pajamas. His face was wet, not from noise but from the ache that fills the body when pain has been faithful for too long. He lifted his head and saw her, and relief spilled across him like light breaking through water. "Henry," she mouthed, stepping into the silvered room. "I'm here." He read her lips, shoulders sagging. He tried to smile, but another stab hit, clear, sharp, and his mouth crumpled. Tears slid without sound. She knelt. "Trust me," she mouthed slowly. "I'll help you." He hesitated, eyes storm-dark, memory full of white coats and cold instruments. Then he let his hand fall away from his ear and nodded, small and desperate. Camille's apron hung on the back of the chair by his desk. She reached for it and slipped a finger into the little inside pocket she had stitched herself. Her hand found the slender weight she had carried for days without admitting it, a straight silver pin, the kind used to rescue loose hems and stubborn threads. It glowed pale in the moonlight, fragile as a thought. Her fingers trembled. She looked at Henry and put her free hand over her heart, then lifted it, a sign they'd made into a promise. He breathed out. She moved closer, careful. "Okay," she mouthed. "We go slowly." He turned his head to the side, trusting her more than he trusted the world. She used her left hand to tilt the small shell of his ear into light. The inside glistened, pink, delicate, and deep. Far back, past the curve and the tender shadows, she saw it again, a dark gleam that was more than a speck. It shivered, recoiling from the light as if it had a will of its own. Her pulse pounded so loud she could feel it in her teeth. She inhaled, exhaled, and whispered where only God could hear, "Please, Lord, guide me." She steadied the pin against the ridge of her fingers and moved as if time were syrup. The tip edged into the ear's gentle tunnel, stopping when his breath hitched, then continuing only when he nodded. Every fraction forward felt like walking on glass barefoot, the house holding its breath with them. The gleam flicked away and then back, a tiny serpent in a narrow garden. Camille angled the tip, not to stab, not to pierce, but to hook, to invite, to lift, to draw out what did not belong. Henry's knuckles whitened around the bedsheet. His eyes were locked on hers, plea and courage braided together. She mouthed, almost, without sound. The thing resisted. She felt the faintest tug travel up the pin, like fishing line humming with a small, stubborn life. "Lord," she breathed, "help me do no harm." The pin slid a whisper deeper. The gleam jerked, then settled. The world narrowed to the space between metal and shadow, to the careful angle of a shaking hand, to the boy's breath counting an unknown mercy. The door burst open. Light from the hallway slashed across the floor. A figure filled the threshold, tall, furious, terrified. Alexander Harrington. "What are you doing to my son?" His voice was not a whisper. It was the thunder that cracks a storm open. He stepped forward, and the bed jolted under his weight. Camille didn't move. If she startled, the pin would slip. If it slipped, harm would follow. She kept her eyes on Henry's, a steady tether. "Please," she mouthed to both of them, not daring to turn. "Don't move. Get away from him." Alexander reached for her shoulder. "Sir, don't." The word was a gasp of air. The pin trembled. Henry's fingers scrambled for her wrist, holding her steady the way someone holds a rung on a ladder over a burning room. For a heartbeat, all three were statues in a single terrible sculpture. The father reaching, the maid kneeling, the boy caught between them, praying with his eyes. Then it happened. The pin caught. The tug changed from resistance to surrender. Something loosened with a slick, obscene slip. Camille drew her hand back, slow as sunrise, and in her palm lay something small, dark, and wet, worm-smooth, glistening like oil, faintly contracting as if learning what air was. It twitched. She recoiled without dropping it. Breath punched from her lungs. Moonlight found the thing and made it shine. Alexander froze, horror erasing the anger in his face. Silence. The kind that is not empty but waiting. Henry's mouth opened. "Camille," he said. The sound was thin at first, like a line drawn too lightly in pencil. But it was a word, shaped, breathed, born. Camille's name, delivered in a voice the world had never been allowed to hear. She stared at him, at his trembling lips, at the astonishment widening his eyes from the inside out. Tears burst from her like water from a struck well. "You spoke," she whispered, hand covering her mouth, the parasite still alive in her other palm. "You spoke." Henry blinked, shocked by the volume of the clock tick, by the whisper of the curtains, by the faint buzz of a light somewhere down the hall. He flinched, then laughed, a raw, broken sound like a first step after a cast comes off. "Dad." His throat caught, then found a soft, shaking syllable. "Dad." Alexander's knees almost failed him. He caught the bedpost with one hand, the other hovering in the air as if he could hold everything in place with his palm. His voice thinned to a human size. "Henry." It was plea, question, answer. Chaos came down the hall like a wave. The butler appeared behind Alexander, eyes sharp with alarm. "Sir, what?" He saw the scene and went white. "Security!" he shouted over his shoulder, panic carving his voice. "Call security now." "No," Camille said, reflex and terror mixing. "Please listen, he can." She didn't finish. Boots thudded. 2 guards entered, training and confusion wrestling for control. Alexander straightened, armor flying back onto him in pieces. Fear made him cruel. "She put something in his ear," he snapped, gesturing at the parasite in Camille's hand as if the crime lay in her palm. "She could have killed him." Camille's words tripped over themselves. "Sir, it was there. I pulled it out." He said. She looked at Henry, as if his new voice could testify for her. Henry reached for her, urgent, small voice raw. Don't hurt her." The butler flinched at the sound, the boy speaking, but years of duty overpowered a single miracle. He nodded to the guards. "Remove her. Restrain if necessary." Camille stood, parasite cradled in one shaking hand, the other lifted empty in a piece that would not be received. "Please," she tried again, voice breaking. "Look at him. Listen to him." Alexander couldn't look. He could only protect, because fear had snatched the wheel. "Take her out," he ordered, softer now but still absolute. "Now." Hands found her arms. They were not cruel, but they were not kind. Henry lunged forward. "No!" The second word of his life tore out like fabric. He grabbed at Camille's sleeve. A guard pulled him gently back. Alexander gathered his son to his chest, eyes burning. "It's okay," he murmured, habit not faith. "It's okay, though nothing was." They dragged Camille into the hall. The house that had taught itself to be quiet suddenly learned how to echo. Her feet slid on the carpet. The parasite slid in her hand, trying to live long enough to be named. "Sir, please," she tried again, turning her head toward the doorway where boy and father were a small sculpture of reunion and confusion. "Don't hurt her!" Henry cried, louder, bewildered by the sound he could finally make and the way it failed to change the world. The butler closed the door between them. The latch clicked. The room and the hallway separated like 2 versions of the same story that would not agree. In the corridor, the guards led Camille toward the security office. Her knees wanted to give, but something steadier than terror kept them straight. Tears blurred the carpet's expensive pattern. She looked down at the slick black thing in her palm, still twitching under the moon glow from a high window. "What are you?" she whispered to it, as if the answer might absolve the living and the dead. Behind the door, father and son clung to each other, the clock loud, the curtain loud, the very night loud. Henry pressed his ear, wincing at a world suddenly full. "Dad," he said again, softer, tasting the word like a fruit he had only ever seen in pictures. Alexander held him tighter, rocking as if he could sue the past he hadn't been able to fix. 4-1 beat. Gratitude flickered through the storm in his chest. Then fear blew it out. He shouted toward the hall, "Call an ambulance!" And the house obeyed, filling once more with the practiced machinery of emergencies and money. Down the corridor, carried by 2 men and 1 stubborn heart, Camille's prayer kept breathing. "Please, Lord, guide us the rest of the way." The hospital lights were too bright. white so pure it erased color. Machines beeped in steady rhythms as if they knew what the human heart refused to say. Alexander Harrington stood in the center of the room, a man dressed in wealth but stripped of certainty. On the bed, his son sat upright for the first time in years, wide-eyed, flinching at every new sound, the whisper of nurses, the roll of a cart, the soft click of the door latch. "Henry," a doctor said gently, "can you hear me?" The boy nodded. His voice came out small, unsure. "Yes." Every head in the room turned toward the sound. It wasn't a whisper. It was a resurrection. Alexander pressed a hand to his chest, as if steadying something too large for his ribs. "He's hearing," he said, almost to himself. "He's really hearing." The doctors looked at one another, disbelief shadowing their faces. Charts flicked in their hands. Screens flashed with new readings. What the maid had done, what she'd pulled out, was now sealed in a specimen jar, black and pulsing faintly in its fluid prison. "We've never seen anything like it," murmured Dr. Levin, the lead specialist. "An organic obstruction, some kind of living biological material. It must have been embedded for years." Alexander's brow tightened. "You're telling me that thing was inside my son this whole time?" Levin nodded. "And it appears to have suppressed nerve function in the auditory system. A parasite, perhaps, though far more complex. The tissue around it shows no trauma. It's as if it adapted to his body, learned to live quietly inside him." Quietly. The word struck like a blade. For 11 years, Henry had lived in silence while Alexander paid clinics, experts, specialists, people who swore the deafness was permanent, hereditary, incurable. And yet, a maid, one woman with no medical training, had undone it all in a single night. "Run the full diagnostics," he ordered. "I want everything tested. Every file, every record from his previous clinic." Within hours, reports filled the table like confessions. Blood work, CT scans, neurological imaging. Each page whispered the same impossible truth. Henry could hear. Perfectly. But it wasn't joy that settled in Alexander's chest. It was suspicion. That afternoon, he drove to the Westbridge Institute, the prestigious clinic that had treated Henry since birth. Marble floors, glass walls, the scent of money and disinfectant. The receptionist smiled when she saw him. "Mr. Harrington, what an honor. How is Henry doing?" He stared at her with eyes gone colder than the marble beneath them. "He's hearing now," he said. "After 11 years under your care." The receptionist froze, the color draining from her face. "That's wonderful news, sir." "I'd like to see Dr. Rains," Alexander said flatly. In the boardroom upstairs, Dr. Rains appeared polished and composed, his white coat perfectly pressed. "Mr. Harrington, please, sit. I heard about the incident. Extraordinary development. We're still processing the lab reports." "Extraordinary." Alexander's voice cracked like dry ice. "You said my son was incurably deaf. You said nothing could be done." Rains folded his hands. "Based on every test we conducted, that was true. If something changed, it's beyond current medical explanation." Alexander's hand slammed onto the table. "Don't insult me. You ran dozens of scans. You took blood, X-rays, tissue samples. And you missed a living organism sitting in his ear for a decade." Rains flinched. "We followed all clinical protocols." "Protocols?" Alexander leaned in. "You took my money, Dr. Rains. Millions. And you told me to stop hoping." Rains hesitated, glancing toward the glass wall where a young assistant pretended not to listen. He lowered his voice. "Mr. Harrington, if you must know, there were internal pressures. Funding. Research. The Institute receives grants for ongoing studies into hereditary deafness. Maintaining a certain number of confirmed cases helps sustain that funding." Alexander's eyes narrowed to slits. "You mean you kept my son deaf, on paper, for money?" The doctor's silence was answer enough. "Where are the files?" "Confidential." Alexander slammed his fist down again. "Where are the Files. An assistant hurried in, trembling, holding a folder marked private, administrative use only. Inside were printed memos, initials scrawled in margins. Maintain diagnosis for research funding. Avoid surgical intervention until data collection complete. Patient H. Harrington shows stability, good for case control set. The pages trembled in Alexander's hands. He felt the words burn like acid. He saw every sleepless night, every failed treatment, every tear from his boy's eyes. He saw himself, throwing money at strangers while refusing to kneel beside his son long enough to notice the quiet wasn't God's punishment, but man's greed. His voice broke when he spoke. You prolonged his pain, for profit. Rains swallowed hard. It wasn't personal. The board. Alexander cut him off, voice rising. The board demanded results, and you used my child as data. 11 years in silence, while you measured him. The doctor's composure crumbled. He slumped into his chair, face pale. We didn't know how to stop it. That thing inside his ear, it was new, unclassified. We thought it was a nerve deformity. Removing it was too risky. The board said we couldn't jeopardize the funding until trials concluded. Alexander stared at him, horror slowly giving way to fury. You watched him suffer because it was convenient for your budget. Downstairs, the receptionist flinched as glass shattered above. The sound carried through the polished halls like thunder. Back at the mansion, Camille sat in a small detention room beside the kitchen. A space once used for storage, now her cage. The guards had left her alone after hours of questioning. A tray of untouched food sat near her. She whispered softly to the silence. Lord, she murmured, I don't understand what's happening. But if that boy can hear, thank you. Please keep him safe. Her eyes closed. Her hands, still faintly trembling, folded together. The bruises on her arms, where the guards had held her, throbbed faintly, but she didn't notice. Somewhere deep inside, she felt peace blooming, fragile but alive. Back at the hospital, Alexander paced the hall, fire burning in his chest. Rains's words echoed like ghosts. Maintain diagnosis for research funding. He had built empires on loyalty and logic, but he'd been blind in his own home. He'd trusted men who saw his son as a statistic. He stopped at the window overlooking the city. The skyline glittered with money and false hope. His reflection in the glass didn't look like a savior or a millionaire. It looked like a man who had paid to keep his child broken. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a man unmaking an empire. No more silence, he whispered. I'll make them answer. And for the first time in years, the great Alexander Harrington no longer feared the sound of his own voice. Flashbulbs exploded like fireworks. The hospital lobby had been transformed overnight into a press room. Rows of cameras, microphones stacked like weapons, reporters shouting over each other for a headline worth millions. The story had already gone viral. Millionaire's deaf son speaks for the first time. But Alexander Harrington wasn't here for headlines. He stood behind the podium, shoulders squared but trembling beneath his navy suit. He wasn't the man the world knew, the polished tycoon of clean deals and colder expressions. He was a father, raw and unarmored, holding the truth like something sharp that still had to be told. Henry sat nearby, small hands folded on the table. The boy flinched each time a camera flashed, new sounds still overwhelming his newly opened world. Beside him stood a doctor, ready to confirm the medical impossibility the world was desperate to believe. But Alexander didn't let the doctor speak first. He gripped the microphone and said, For 11 years, my son lived in silence. His voice wavered, but the room fell still. I spent millions trying to fix him. I built hospitals, funded studies, and paid men who promised miracles. But last night, a woman who owns nothing healed what my money could not. The reporters murmured, leaning forward. Alexander's eyes found the cameras. Her name is Camille Johnson. She's a maid. She works in my home. And because of her courage, my son can hear me. Gasps rippled across the room. The words carried more power than any fortune he had ever earned. The medical team at Westbridge Institute, he continued, his tone tightening, lied to us. They falsified reports, concealed evidence, and kept my son in silence to maintain their research funding. A reporter shouted, "Do you have proof of that, Mr. Harrington?" Alexander held up a folder, the same one he had pulled from the clinic the night before. Every memo, every signature, every lie. They prolonged his pain for profit. He set the folder down hard, papers scattering like feathers. And I was too blind to see it. Too proud to question men who spoke the language of authority while my son spoke none. A silence followed, thick, electric, heavy with shame and awe. "I can't undo 11 years, he said softly. "But I can make sure no other child lives that long in silence again." He took a step away from the podium, voice steadying. "That's why, today, I'm creating the Harrington Foundation for Children with Hearing Loss. It will provide free diagnosis, treatment, and care for every child, regardless of wealth or background. And the first person I'm hiring to lead it," he paused, emotion breaking through the cracks of his composure, "is Camille Johnson." The room erupted. Gasps, applause, a storm of questions. Cameras snapped like lightning as journalists called out, "Where is she? Is it true she was arrested? Has she been released?" Alexander lifted a hand. "She's on her way here now." Downstairs, in a quiet security office, Camille sat at a metal table, wrists free but heart still in chains. The guards who had once eyed her like a criminal now avoided her gaze. A nurse burst in, breathless. "They want her upstairs. Now." Camille blinked. "Why?" The nurse smiled through tears. "Because the world knows the truth." Minutes later, she stepped into the lobby. The crowd turned. Flashbulbs caught her in mid-step. The plain uniform, the weary eyes, the quiet woman who had done the impossible. Alexander moved toward her, ignoring the cameras. "Camille," he said, voice thick, "I owe you more than I can ever repay." She shook her head quickly. "Sir, please, don't. I didn't do it for praise." Her voice trembled. "I just didn't want him to suffer." He took her hand, something unthinkable for a man like him. The cameras froze, recording a moment wealth couldn't stage. "You didn't just heal him, Camille," Alexander said softly. "You healed me." The applause that followed wasn't for spectacle. It was for truth breaking free after years of walls. Henry stood, small and brave, tugging at Camille's sleeve. "Thank you," he said, voice shaky but clear. She turned to him, eyes wet. "You don't need to thank me," she whispered. "You've already given me more than you know." Alexander stepped back to the podium as reporters shouted questions. "Mr. Harrington, what will happen to the doctors responsible?" His gaze turned hard again, controlled, but righteous. "Justice will," he said. "Every name on those documents will answer for what they did." "And you, sir?" a reporter asked. "What do you take responsibility for?" He looked down for a moment, then straight into the sea of lenses. "For being rich enough to believe I could buy healing. For mistaking control for love. For thinking silence was safety when it was really fear." His words landed like scripture. The applause rose again, not for the man he'd been, but for the one finally learning to listen. Hours later, the press had gone. The hospital lobby was quiet, echoing with the hum of cleaning machines and fading adrenaline. Alexander, Camille, and Henry sat together in a small lounge near the children's wing. The boy was still discovering sound, the buzz of the vending machine, the soft thump of a janitor's mop, the whisper of wind against glass. "Everything's so loud," Henry said, wincing slightly. "It'll get better," Camille said gently. "You'll learn which sounds matter." He smiled faintly. "Like voices." "Like love," she replied. Alexander watched the exchange, his throat tightening. For 11 years, he had been the richest man in every room, and the poorest in the one that mattered. "Camille," he said quietly, "when you touched his ear that night, what made you so sure?" She looked down. "I wasn't sure," she admitted. "I was just tired of watching him hurt. Sometimes love doesn't wait for permission, it just acts." He nodded, eyes damp. Then maybe love is the only thing that still works without funding. They sat in companionable silence as dusk bled into the windows. For the first time, the quiet didn't feel heavy, it felt earned. Henry leaned his head against his father's arm, a gesture so natural it broke something open in Alexander's chest. "Dad," the boy said softly, testing the word like a secret. Alexander's breath caught. "Yes, son. I can hear you." The words were simple, but they landed with the weight of years lost and found. Alexander covered his son's hand, his voice trembling. "And I'll never stop listening again." Camille rose quietly to give them a moment. As she turned to leave, Alexander called out, "Camille!" She paused. "When the foundation opens," he said, "it won't bear my name alone. It'll bear yours too." Her eyes widened. "Sir." He smiled faintly. "It's not charity. It's gratitude." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then let's make it about the children. Not us." He smiled. "That's exactly why it should be yours." Outside, the first evening rain began to fall, tapping softly against the windows. Henry tilted his head toward the sound, wonder blooming in his eyes. "What's that?" he asked. Camille smiled through tears. "That's rain," she said. "That's what the world sounds like when it's washing itself clean." And for once, Alexander didn't just hear it, he listened. Weeks passed, and the Harrington mansion, once a monument to silence, began to sound like a home again. Gone were the hushed corridors where footsteps died mid-echo and conversations never reached laughter. Now, voices floated through the air like sunlight across polished marble. The same walls that once guarded quiet now learned the rhythm of joy. Every morning, the garden burst alive with the sound of Henry's voice. Small, curious, unsteady, but full of wonder. "Tree!" he shouted, pointing to the oak that shaded the fountain. "Bird!" he laughed, chasing a flutter of wings across the hedges. "Music!" he cried, when the gardener's radio hummed from the path. Camille often watched from the terrace, hands clasped around a mug of tea, still half amazed that all this was real. Sometimes she laughed with him, sometimes she simply listened, each syllable from the boy's mouth feeling like a prayer answered twice. Once for Henry, and once for the brother she'd lost. Inside, the house no longer ran on fear or precision. The butler, once stiff as glass, found himself smiling without reason. The staff spoke freely now, their laughter not a rebellion but a rhythm. The mansion had softened. Its silence had been forgiven. Alexander Harrington, the man who once commanded silence like a currency, had changed too. He worked from a smaller office now. No marble floors, no sweeping desk, just a window that opened to the garden. His empire still thrived, but his days were spent differently. Contracts were shorter. Meetings ended early. He had learned the sound of his son's laughter, and nothing on earth could outbid that. Camille sat beside him most days, not as a maid anymore, but as a partner in rebuilding something larger than both of them. Together, they planned the Harrington Foundation for children with hearing loss, turning pain into purpose. She oversaw the outreach programs, writing letters to families who had lost hope. Alexander handled the funding, no longer as a businessman but as a man making amends. In one letter, Camille wrote, "Sometimes healing begins when someone finally listens. Not to doctors, not to money, but to love itself." When Alexander read those words, he didn't edit them. He framed them. One golden evening, when the world was wrapped in the kind of light that forgives everything, the three of them gathered in the garden. The fountain that once gurgled alone now played background to laughter. The air smelled of roses and wet grass. Henry was chasing fireflies near the hedge, his voice cutting through the still air like a melody rediscovered. "Dad!" he called out. Alexander looked up from the bench, where he and Camille sat side by side. "Yes, son." Henry pointed at Camille, who was kneeling to collect the firefly he had cupped in his hands. The boy's voice came softer now, careful and deliberate. "She's my hero." Camille froze, the small light flickering between her palms. She looked at him, stunned. Alexander's throat tightened, words catching in the place where pride and gratitude collide. He smiled through it. "She's mine too." Camille laughed softly, trying to blink away tears. Henry ran toward the fountain, setting his glowing prize free. The water sparkled under the low sun, droplets catching fire in the light. Its sound, once just a faint whisper, now rose like applause. They watched him play, his voice filling the spaces that once ached with silence. Every shout, every giggle, every sound was a miracle made ordinary by love. Alexander leaned back against the bench, eyes tracing the boy's movements. "You know," he said after a moment, voice low, "I spent years trying to make this house perfect. Every wall, every corner. But it never felt alive until now." Camille smiled. "Perfection's quiet. Life isn't." He turned toward her, expression gentle. "You gave my son his hearing." She looked out at the fountain, where Henry's reflection danced in ripples. "No, Mr. Harrington," she said softly. "I just helped him listen." The words hung between them, not heavy but sacred. Henry turned suddenly, his voice bright as he pointed at the horizon. "Look, sunset." And they did. Together. The sky blazed in orange and gold, clouds curling like paint strokes across the evening. The world, it seemed, was finally speaking to them in color and sound. A nurse from the new foundation had once asked Camille how she'd done it, how she'd found the courage to act when no one else would. Camille had only smiled. "Faith," she'd said. "It's the one thing that speaks louder than fear." Now, sitting beside the man who had once doubted everything except power, she felt that truth settled deeper than ever. Alexander's hand rested on the bench beside hers. Not reaching, not asking, just there. The space between them had changed shape. Not employer and servant anymore. Not gratitude and guilt. Just two people bound by a miracle that had demanded all they had to give. In the fading light, the fountain's music rose louder, carrying the sound of Henry's laughter. Camille closed her eyes for a moment, listening. The trickle of water, the soft rustle of leaves, the echo of a boy's joy, it all folded into a harmony she'd never known she needed. And then, as if speaking to both of them, the narrator of life itself seemed to whisper through the breeze. Sometimes silence doesn't come from our ears. It comes from hearts that stop listening. And sometimes, it takes someone with nothing but faith to remind us what love truly sounds like. The last of the sun slipped beyond the horizon, leaving a calm that didn't ache. Alexander turned to Camille. "I used to think sound was proof of life," he said quietly. "Now I know, it's love that proves it." Camille smiled. "Then the world must be alive tonight." Henry's laughter echoed again, carried by wind and water and grace. The mansion behind them glowed warm through its open windows, every light soft and human. Somewhere in those walls, silence finally found peace, not as an absence, but as a memory. And for the first time in forever, Alexander Harrington didn't measure success in numbers or silence, but in the sound of his son calling, "Dad!" across a garden where love had finally learned to speak. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that love, not power, is what truly saves us, then don't let it stop here. Join us, and be part of a community that believes in compassion, courage, and the miracles that still happen in silence. Subscribe now to Tales by Amani, turn on the notification bell, and stay with us for more true stories that prove one thing. Sometimes the greatest riches are found in the human heart.